John had always been a man of ambition. From the moment he stepped into the world of business, he had one clear goal: to succeed. And he did. Over the years, John built a financial empire, becoming one of the most influential businessmen in the country. Along with that success came the wealth, prestige, and responsibilities that filled his life. But there was one dream he had never fulfilled. One that belonged not just to him, but also to his wife, Clara. From the day they were married, Clara had always talked about traveling the world. She wanted to see the snow-capped mountains of Switzerland, the lavender fields of Provence, the ancient ruins in Greece. But for John, there was never enough time. There was always another deal to close, another project to manage, another opportunity too good to pass up. Clara, always patient, waited. "Someday," she would say with a smile whenever their plans were postponed. "We'll go when the time is right." But now, after all the years of waiting, it was clear to both of them that the time would never be right. Not in the way they had once imagined. It had started with a cough, just a small one, that Clara brushed off as nothing. But as the months passed, the cough grew worse, and the trips to the doctor became more frequent. The diagnosis came one cold afternoon, as the leaves turned golden and fell from the trees. Clara was sick, very sick, and this time, no amount of money or influence could change. John sat in the doctor's office, staring blankly at the wall as the words echoed in his ears. Terminal. Months. Maybe less. His mind, always so sharp in the boardroom, failed to process the reality before him. Clara, his wife of 40 years, was dying. As they drove home in silence, John's mind was racing. How could this happen? How could time have slipped through his fingers so easily? They had everything but the one thing that now mattered most. That night, Clara sat by the window, staring out at the darkening sky. John watched her, feeling a knot tighten in his chest. He had promised her the world, but all he had given her was a life of waiting. Waiting for the right moment, waiting for him to be free of his commitments, waiting for something that would never come. But as he sat there, watching her fragile figure bathed in moonlight, a thought formed in his mind. Perhaps it wasn't too late. Perhaps they could still take that trip. The world was still out there waiting for them, and though their time was short, it was time he would not waste. The next morning, John made a decision. They were going to travel. They were going to live the dream they had deferred for so long. It didn't matter how sick Clara was, how much it would cost, or how hard it would be to manage. They would make it happen, and they would do it now. There was no more time to wait. John wasted no time. He immediately began planning the trip down to the Essie. He called in favors, spoke with doctors, and hired a full-time nurse to accompany them. Private jets, medical equipment, and all the accommodations Clara would need were arranged. Money wasn't an issue, but time was. The urgency weighed heavily on him as he watched Clara grow weaker each day. There were moments when he wondered if they would even make it to their first destination. Clara, ever the optimist, met his enthusiasm with a gentle smile. "You don't have to do all this, John," she whispered one night as they lay in bed, her voice weak but tender. "I'm happy just being with you. We don't have to go anywhere." But John couldn't bear the thought of not giving her this one final adventure. He had spent their entire lives putting things off, promising they would do it later. Now there was no later, only now. "I want to," he said firmly. "We deserve this. You deserve this." And so, the plans continued. Their itinerary was ambitious, perhaps too ambitious, John thought to himself in moments of doubt. From the snow-covered Alps of Switzerland to the sun-drenched coasts of Greece, they would visit the places Clara had always dreamed of. He could see the strain on her face as they prepared, but Clara never complained. The day of their departure arrived quicker than either of them anticipated. Their bags were packed, the plane was ready, and the nurse, an experienced and kind woman named Helen, was waiting with them at the airport. Clara, bundled in layers of blankets, looked up at John with a tired but contented expression. "We're really doing this, aren't we?" she asked softly. John nodded, a tight smile on his face. "Yes, we are." As they boarded the private jet, John couldn't help but feel a mixture of excitement and dread. He had made sure every possible detail was accounted for, but one thing remained out of his control: Clara's health. Every moment felt like borrowed time. But as the plane took off and Clara closed her eyes, leaning her head on his shoulder, he knew they were doing the right thing. This trip, however long or short, was their last chance to live the life they had always dreamed of. As the plane soared through the clouds, John glanced at his wife, her face calm and peaceful. For the first time in years, he felt like he was truly giving her something that wasn't tied to success or wealth, but to love and time. The air in Switzerland was crisp, almost biting as they stepped off the plane, but the view made it all worthwhile. Snow-capped peaks towered above them, a breathtaking sight that had Clara smiling, her eyes bright with wonder. John held her arm tightly as they descended the steps, feeling the cold wind rush through his coat. He wasn't sure how long they could stay here given the altitude and the thin air, but for now it didn't matter. They had arrived, and that was what counted. Helen, the nurse, quickly set up Clara's wheelchair, and they began the short journey to the chalet where they would be staying. The small village below the mountains was picturesque, almost like something out of a fairy tale. Wooden cottages with smoking chimneys dotted the landscape, while the white blanket of snow sparkled under the view. Inside the warmth of the chalet, Clara sat by the large window staring out at the snowy peaks. She had always dreamed of visiting Switzerland, and now, after all these years, here they were. John sat beside her, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that they had made it this far, sadness because he knew they couldn't stay long. "Do you remember that travel book I used to keep on the nightstand?" Clara asked softly, her voice carrying the gentle rasp of someone who had been through too. John smiled, his mind flickering back to all the nights he had seen Clara poring over that old book, her eyes lighting up at the pictures of distant places. "Of course I do. You never stopped talking about Switzerland." Clara chuckled, though the sound was weak. "I always wanted to see the Alps. I imagined us skiing down the slopes, sitting by a fire afterward, sipping hot chocolate. I guess we'll have to skip the skiing part." John reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "We don't need ski, just being here is enough." The day passed quietly, with Clara taking in the view and John doing everything in his power to make her comfortable. They spent the afternoon in silence, enjoying each other's company, as if speaking would disrupt the tranquility of the moment. But as night fell, the peacefulness of the day gave way to John's growing anxiety. He watched Clara sleep, her breathing shallow and labored. It seemed like each day she was fading more, and despite everything, he couldn't shake the feeling that time was slipping through his fingers once again. It was early morning when things took a turn. Clara woke up gasping for air, her face pale, and her body trembling. John leapt out of bed, calling for Helen, who rushed in with medical supplies. The chalet suddenly felt stifling, the cozy atmosphere giving way to panic. Helen worked quickly, checking Clara's vitals and administering oxygen. John hovered nearby, his heart pounding in his chest. Clara's breathing slowed, but her eyes remained half-closed, her strength clearly waning. "We might need to get her to a hospital," Helen said, her voice calm but urgent. John's stomach sank. A hospital? That wasn't part of the plan. They were supposed to be making memories, not sitting in sterile rooms. But what choice did he have? He couldn't lose her. Not yet. "How bad is it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Helen glanced at him, her expression serious. "It's not good, John, the altitude, the cold, and it's taking a toll on her." John felt the weight of the world crashing down on him. "Can she travel? Can we get her to somewhere safer?" Helen nodded. "We can get her to a lower altitude. There's a hospital in the next town. It's small, but they'll have what she needs." John nodded, his throat tight as he struggled to hold back tears. "Let's do it," he said, his voice cracking. The trip to the hospital. John sat beside Clara in the back of the car, holding her hand as Helen monitored her condition. The drive felt endless, the winding mountain roads doing nothing to ease the knot in John's stomach. He kept glancing at Clara, her frail body leaning against him, her eyes barely open. By the time they reached the hospital, Clara was unconscious. John followed the doctors as they wheeled her into the emergency room, his heart racing. He had known this would be hard. He had known that Clara was sick, that this trip would be their last, but he hadn't expected it to happen so soon, so abruptly. Hours passed as John sat in the waiting room, his head in his hands. Helen stayed by his side, quietly reassuring him that Clara was in good hands. But nothing could soothe the ache in his chest. He felt helpless, useless, like he had failed her. When the doctor finally emerged, John stood up, his heart in his throat. "She's stable for now," the doctor said. "But we'll need to keep her here for a few days, at least until her breathing improves." John nodded, relief flooding him, though it was mixed with guilt. They had pushed too hard. He had pushed too hard, all because he wanted to give her something that, in the end, didn't matter as much as simply being together. The days in the Swiss hospital felt like an eternity. John spent every moment by Clara's side, watching her slowly regain her strength, but he couldn't shake the fear that had settled in his. Every breath she took seemed fragile, like the thin glass of a window rattling in the wind. After what felt like weeks, but was only a few days, Clara's doctors finally gave them the go-ahead to continue their journey at a slower pace. John knew they couldn't afford to push their luck again, but Clara had been adamant about moving forward. "I want to see the lavender fields," she had said softly, her voice regaining a touch of the brightness it once had. "We can take our time, but I still want to." John nodded, holding her hand gently. He would take her anywhere she wanted. Provence, with its gentle hills and endless lavender fields, would be their next stop. The flight to France was smoother than their last journey, though John remained on edge the entire time, glancing nervously at Clara with every cough or movement she made. But when they landed, there was a calmness in the air, a warmth that wrapped around them as if Provence itself were welcoming them with open arms. As they drove through the French countryside, the sun bathed the fields in a golden light. The air was thick with the scent of lavender, a sweet perfume that Clara inhaled deeply, smiling for the first time in what felt like forever. "Look at those fields, John," Clara whispered, her eyes wide with wonder. "It's just like I imagined it would be." They arrived at a small rustic inn nestled among the lavender fields. The owners, an older French couple, greeted them warmly, their accents thick and comforting as they showed them to their room. From the window, they could see the purple fields stretching out to the horizon, the soft hum of bees in the air. John wheeled Clara out to the garden where she could sit and breathe in the fragrant air. The lavender swayed in the breeze, and for a moment, everything seemed perfect. Clara was content, her eyes half closed as she soaked in the beauty of the place she had dreamed of visiting for so many years. John sat beside her, his heart swelling with both love and sadness. He had spent so much of their life together working, pushing, striving for more. But here, in the quiet of the Provençal countryside, none of that mattered. What mattered was this moment, this time with Clara. "Do you remember when we used to talk about traveling the world?" Clara asked suddenly, her vow. John nodded. "Every night. We had so many plans." Clara smiled wistfully. "We did. But I think I was happiest just being with you, wherever we were. This trip, it's beautiful, but I would have been just as happy at home, as long as we were together." John's chest tightened, guilt washing over him. He had spent so long trying to give her the world, to make up for the time they had lost, that he had forgotten what truly mattered. It wasn't the destinations, the experiences, or even the luxury he could provide. It was just being with her, wherever they were. They spent several days in Provence, walking through the lavender fields when Clara felt strong enough, sitting by the fire at night sharing quiet conversations about the past. The pace was slower now, less urgent. John had finally realized that they didn't need to rush. Every moment they had was precious no matter where they were. On the last evening in Provence, Clara and John sat together on the porch of the inn, watching the sun set over the fields. The sky was painted with shades of pink and orange, and the lavender seemed to glow in the fading light. It was one of those perfect moments, the kind you wish could last forever. "Do you ever think about the choices we made?" Clara asked, her voice thoughtful as she leaned her head against John's shoulder. John frowned, unsure of what she meant. "What choices?" Clara smiled softly, her fingers tracing patterns on his hand. "The way we lived our lives, the things we prioritized. I used to wonder if we were doing it right, if waiting was the right choice." John's heart sank. He had thought about it so many times over the years, the regret gnawing at him every time he missed another anniversary or birthday because of a business trip or a meeting. He had thought about all the moments they could have had, the places they could have seen if only he had made D. "I used to think I could make it up to you," John admitted quietly. "That if I worked hard enough we could do everything we dreamed of later. But now, I don't know if that was fair to you." Clara shook her head gently. "It was never about fairness, John. You gave me so much, a life I never dreamed of. But sometimes I did wonder what it would have been like if we had just gone on those trips when we were younger." John swallowed hard, guilt heavy in his chest. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I should have made more time for us." Clara lifted her head and looked into his eyes, her gaze full of love and understanding. "You don't have to be sorry. We had a beautiful life together. Maybe we didn't travel as much as we wanted to, but we built a home. We had each other, and we've shared more love than most people ever get to experience. That's enough for me." John felt the tears welling up in his eyes, but he blinked them away, not wanting to show his weakness. Clara had always been the strong one, the one who carried their love with grace even when he had been too distracted to notice. "We're here now," she continued softly, "and that's what matters. I've never needed more than this." John nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He had always believed that he needed to give Clara the world, that his success could somehow repay her for the sacrifices she had made. But now he realized that it wasn't the grand gestures that mattered, it was the quiet moments, the small, simple acts of love that had carried them through the years. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky darkened, John held Clara close, feeling the warmth of her body against his. They didn't need to say anything more. In that moment, everything was understood. The Greek islands were everything Clara had imagined. Whitewashed buildings with blue rooftops dotted the coastline, and the water shimmered under the bright Mediterranean sun. As their ferry approached the dock, John noticed the way Clara's eyes lit up, even though her body seemed frailer than ever. He could feel the weight of time pressing down on them, but the sight of Clara smiling gave him hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, they could finish this journey together. They stayed in a small villa perched on a cliff, with a panoramic view of the sea. Every evening, Clara would sit on the terrace, watching the sun set into the horizon, casting hues of pink and gold across. It was a simple, quiet life, but for them it was enough. "Do you remember the pictures of Greece in that old travel book?" Clara asked one evening, her voice barely above a whisper. She was wrapped in a thick blanket, though the evening was warm. John smiled, sitting beside her. "You showed me that picture at least 100 times. Every time you'd point to the sunset and say, 'One day, we'll see that together.'" Clara closed her eyes and leaned her head back, letting the sea breeze kiss her fall. "It's even more beautiful than I imagined." But despite the beauty around them, John couldn't ignore the signs that Clara was slipping further away. Her once vivid conversations had become shorter, her energy drained by the simplest of tasks. Even though she never complained, he saw it in the way she struggled to lift her head or the way her hands shook when she reached for a glass of water. One evening, as they sat watching the sunset, Clara spoke, her voice barely audible. "John, I don't think I can go any further." John's heart sank. He had known this moment would come, but hearing the words out loud made it real. He turned to her, forcing a smile. "We've already come so far, Clara. We don't have to go anywhere else." Clara's hand reached for his, her grip weak but reassuring. "You've given me everything I ever wanted. This trip, it's been more than enough." John felt a lump form in his throat. He had always been so focused on doing more, on making up for lost time, but now he realized that Clara didn't need more. She just needed him. "I don't want it to end," he whispered, his voice breaking. Clara smiled softly, her eyes filled with a quiet peace. "Neither do I, but it's okay. We've had our adventure." That night, Clara's breathing grew more labored. John stayed by her side, holding her hand, his heart heavy with the knowledge that this was the end. She had fought so hard, but her body was giving up, and there was nothing more he could do but be with her. The next morning, as the sun began to rise over the horizon, Clara's breathing slowed. The nurse, Helen, who had been with them throughout the trip, checked her vitals and looked at John with sad, knowing eyes. There was no need for words. John leaned over, brushing a stray hair from Clara's face. "I love you," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I always have, and I always will." Clara's eyes fluttered open one last time, and she smiled weakly. "I know," she whispered back. "I love you too." And with that, her eyes closed, and her breathing stopped. The room was quiet, save for the soft hum of the wind outside. John sat there for what felt like hours, holding her hand, unable to let go. He had known this moment would come, but nothing could have prepared him for the emptiness that filled him now. She was gone, and he was alone. When Helen gently touched his shoulder, offering her condolences, John nodded, his face wet with tears. He didn't want to leave her, but he knew he had to. They arranged for Clara's body to be taken back home, and John followed the procedures numbly. Everything felt surreal, as if he were watching it all from a distance. The villa that had once been filled with her presence now felt unbearably quiet. John stood on the terrace that evening, watching the sunset over the sea, just as he and Clara had done so many times in the past few days. But this time, it felt different. The colors were the same, pink and gold streaking across the sky. But the world felt empty without her beside him. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the wind, feeling the weight of his guilt settle over him. "I'm sorry I didn't do more. I'm sorry I made you wait." But deep down, he knew that Clara had forgiven him long ago. She had never needed the grand gestures or the exotic destinations. All she had ever wanted was time with him, and in the end, they had found that. Returning home without Clara was one of the hardest things John had ever done. The house felt cold and empty, without her laughter, without her voice filling the spaces they had shared for so many years. Every room held memories of her. Her favorite chair by the window, the soft blanket she always used, the framed pictures from their younger years that still lined the walls. John spent the first few days in a daze, wandering through the house, unsure of what to do next. The silence was suffocating, and he found himself avoiding the places where they had spent the most time together. It was too painful to sit by the window without her beside him, too hard to sleep in the bed that now felt far too big for just one person. But as the days passed, John began to find comfort in the memories they had made. He looked through the photos from their last trip, smiling at the pictures of Clara standing in the lavender fields, her face lit up with joy. He could almost hear her voice again, see her smile, feel the warmth of her presence beside him. The journey had been hard, and it had ended too soon, but it had been worth it. Clara had been happy, and that was all that mattered. John spent hours sitting in the living room, looking out at the garden they had once tended together. The flowers Clara had planted were blooming, their colors bright and cheerful, a reminder that life, even in its fleeting moments, was beautiful. As the weeks turned into months, John found solace in the routine of life. He returned to work, though it no longer held the same meaning it once had. His priorities had shifted. What mattered most to him now wasn't the success or the wealth he had spent his life building, but the simple joys he had shared with Clara, the laughter, the quiet evenings, the love they had nurtured through the years. One afternoon, As John was sorting through some of Clara's things, he found the old travel book she had kept by their bedside for so many years. The pages were worn and the cover was faded, but as he flipped through the pictures, memories of their dreams came flooding back. They had traveled to some of the places in that book, but there were many more they had never seen. Greece, Switzerland, Provence. Those had been beautiful, but there were still so many untouched pages, so many places they had talked about visiting but never had the chance to. John sat there for a long time, staring at the open pages. He had never been one for travel, always too busy with work, too focused on the next big deal. But Clara had taught him something in those last few months. They had learned together that life wasn't about waiting for the perfect moment. It was about seizing the time they had. With that thought, John made a decision. He couldn't bring Clara back, but he could honor her memory in the best way he knew how. He would continue the journey they had started. The next week, John packed a bag and booked The destination didn't matter as much as the journey itself. He wasn't running from his grief, nor was he trying to escape the memories of Clara. Instead, he was carrying her with him, in every step, in every breath, in every new adventure he would have. As the plane took off, John looked out the window, watching the world shrink beneath him. Clara had been right all along. Life was about more than the places you went. It was about the people you loved, the time you spent together, and the memories you carried with you. He smiled softly, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't felt since she passed. This was his way of keeping her with him, of continuing the adventure they had always dreamed of. And as the clouds rolled by outside the window, John knew that Clara was with him, wherever he went. John's journey reminds us all of an important truth. Life is fleeting, and the moments we share with the people we love don't wait for the perfect time to create memories with your family and friends. Start today. Whether it's a small trip, a conversation, or simply spending time together, these moments are priceless. Cherish them before it's too late. If this story touched your heart, let us know in the comments below. How do you plan to make the most of the time with your loved ones? And don't forget to subscribe for more heartfelt stories that inspire, uplift, and remind us all of what truly matters.